It was a quiet Sunday morning in Brooklyn, the kind of morning where the city hasn't fully woken up yet. The streets were still. Coffee cups steamed near windows. Radios murmured softly in the background. Nothing suggested history was about to move. Then the silence broke. Phones began to vibrate one after another. Notifications stacked. YouTube feeds refreshed. Social media timelines suddenly surged with urgency. A message was spreading not from Washington, not from Paris, not from a polished studio with teleprompters and flags, but from far away, from the heart of West Africa, from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. This wasn't a politician reading talking points. This wasn't a press release. It was a man in a simple military uniform seated in a modest room. No palace, no gold, no performance, just steady eyes, a calm voice, and words that felt personal, almost uncomfortably so. The man speaking was Ibrahim Traoré, and he wasn't only speaking to his people back home. He was speaking to you, to black families in Chicago and Detroit, to elders who still remember segregation, to young people who grew up hearing sirens more often than lullabies, to descendants of Africans scattered across America, the Caribbean, Brazil, across the Atlantic. What followed didn't sound like politics. It sounded like memory, like unfinished business, like a voice reaching across centuries of silence to say something most had never heard before. Africa did not forget you. For 40 minutes, history wasn't debated, it was felt. The pain of slavery, the lies that followed, the names erased, the cultures beaten down. And then quietly but firmly came something else, an invitation. Not to protest, not to riot, but to reconnect, to rebuild. To imagine Africa not as a graveyard of suffering, but as a living home. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because if even part of this message is true, then it challenges everything we've been taught about power, belonging, and who gets to write the future. So here's the question you need to sit with as we begin. Was this a dangerous illusion, or the beginning of something the world wasn't ready to hear? Stay with me, because what unfolded next didn't just shake Burkina Faso, it unsettled the West, rattled old systems, and forced millions to ask a question they'd avoided their entire lives. And by the end, I want to know what you think. Do you believe this kind of message can truly unite a broken people, or does it risk tearing everything apart? Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. The camera did not move. It didn't zoom. It didn't shake. It didn't search for drama. It stayed fixed on the face of Ibrahim Traoré, a young man seated upright wearing a plain military uniform that looked less like a symbol of power and more like work clothes. The kind worn by someone who expects to get his hands dirty. There was no grand backdrop behind him, no ornate flags, no chandelier, just the quiet weight of history filling the room. Behind him, old maps of Africa hung on the wall, maps from before borders were carved with foreign rulers and straight lines. Maps from a time before the continent was sliced apart and renamed. Framed photographs shared the space with those maps: Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X. Not idols, not decorations, witnesses. He began calmly but without distance. "I am a young man," he said. "They call me a revolutionary. They say I seized power. They say I defied France." There was no attempt to soften those claims, no denial, no apology. Instead, he met them head-on and reframed them. Yes, he acknowledged, "I did those things, not for glory, not for fame, but for dignity." Then he drew a clear line. This message, he said, was not only for Burkina Faso. It wasn't even only for Africa. It was for the millions of descendants of Africans scattered across the Atlantic, those taken, displaced, renamed, and told that their separation from the continent was permanent. And then he did something unexpected. He didn't start with anger. He started with pain. He spoke of slavery and colonialism not as abstract chapters in a textbook, but as twin assaults that tore Africa's soul in half. One part remained on the land. The other was dragged across oceans in chains. Families were split. Languages were beaten out of children. Gods were renamed. Names were erased. "You were taken," he said plainly, "by force." The words landed heavily, especially in places like Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem cities, where the legacy of that force still echoes in housing lines, prison statistics, and police sirens. Then he addressed the shame that had been deliberately planted over generations, the lie repeated so often it began to feel like truth. "They told you we sold you," he said. That Africans sold their own people. He rejected that narrative outright. He reminded listeners that many African kingdoms resisted the slave trade, that kings and queens fought it, that betrayal was not culture, it was coercion. Guns in one hand, Bibles in the other, divide and conquer, brother turned against brother. They rewrote history, he said, and they taught you to doubt your own worth. But even as languages were stripped away, he argued something deeper survived. The rhythm of movement, the beat in music, the cadence of speech, the instinct to dance, to sing, to mourn together, that he said is Africa still speaking inside you. Across the United States, something shifted. Barbershops went quiet. Radios were turned down. Elders leaned forward. Younger listeners, many raised far from any sense of origin, felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the surface. Not rage, recognition. Then the tone changed. This was not a memorial service. I didn't come just to remind you of the chains, he said. We all know the chains. He came to say something more dangerous. The chains, he declared, were breaking again. He spoke of what was unfolding in the Sahel of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, rejecting a new form of colonialism that no longer relied on ships or whips, but on contracts, debt, and obedient leaders. He named it clearly neo-colonial control. They don't rule us with soldiers anymore, he said. They rule us with money. And then he issued the challenge that made the message impossible to ignore. They fear me, he said quietly. Not because of my power, but because I remind them of Sankara. The man was gone. The ideas were not. And then he turned the lens outward past Africa, past governments, past institutions, directly toward the descendants of those who had been taken. They fear you too, he said, because if the children of Africa who were taken and those who remained ever stand together, everything changes. That was the moment the message stopped being history. It became a warning and an invitation. The shift came without warning. Until that moment, the message had felt like remembrance, heavy, intimate, almost sacred. But then the tone hardened. The voice on the screen didn't rise. It didn't shout. It became sharper, more deliberate, as if the speaker understood that history alone does not move systems. Action does. I didn't come just to speak, said Ibrahim Traoré. I came to invite you. What followed was the announcement that turned a moving speech into a global shockwave. Burkina Faso, alongside Mali and Niger, would launch a diaspora citizenship initiative. Descendants of enslaved Africans, he declared, would be eligible for fast-track citizenship, not symbolic papers, real passports, real rights, access to land in revitalized rural zones, investment opportunities, a place to build not as tourists, not as outsiders, but as returning family. The reaction was immediate. In living rooms across America, people sat upright. In some places, tears fell. In others, skepticism surfaced just as fast. Was this real? Was it a trap? Was this too good to be true? Traoré leaned forward, speaking directly into the lens. If you feel homeless in America, he said, you are not homeless. You are landless, and land can be reclaimed. Then he did something no leader had dared to do so publicly. He spoke directly to individuals, calling out their pain by name. To the young man in Oakland who feels hunted every time he sees flashing lights. To the mother in New Orleans teaching her children Black history because the schools won't. To the rapper in Atlanta with influence but no direction. To the grandmother in Detroit who carries memories of lynching, loss, and humiliation in her bones. Come home, he said, again and again. The message rippled outward. Celebrities were addressed, not shamed, but invited. Their influence, he argued, meant more in Africa than anywhere else. Not for endorsement, for construction, for narrative, for responsibility. Within hours, Western media scrambled. CNN and the BBC gave the story brief, dismissive coverage, labeling it symbolic, unrealistic, dangerous. Analysts waved it away as rhetoric, but online a different reality was unfolding. Pan-African channels lit up. YouTube streams exploded. Twitter threads multiplied. The question wasn't whether people were listening. They were. A week later, the counterattack began. Western outlets shifted tone. Articles appeared describing Traoré as a militant destabilizer. Anonymous documents surfaced accusing him of plotting to fracture the region. Sanctions tightened. Diplomatic pressure mounted. The message was clear: this had gone too far. Then came the night that pushed everything to the edge. It was a cool Harmattan night in Ouagadougou when the city went dark, not gradually, instantly. Phones died, networks collapsed, emergency lines jammed. At first, people assumed it was another routine blackout. It wasn't. At 2:16 a.m., gunfire shattered the silence. Rogue soldiers, men trained under old foreign doctrines, stormed a communications tower with one objective: remove Traore, dismantle the Diaspora initiative, and restore stability. Quiet assurances had already been made to external powers. Silence in exchange for obedience. But they miscalculated. They hadn't accounted for the Sankara Guard, a newly formed protective unit composed of Pan-African volunteers, including Diaspora ex-military personnel. They had been monitoring unusual movements. When the coup attempt began, they moved faster. By the time the rebels reached the presidential compound, they were blocked. The exchange of gunfire was short but fierce. 2 guards fell. Several attackers were captured. The rest fled into the darkness. Traore never fled. Instead, his voice cut through the blackout from a hidden backup transmitter beneath an abandoned foreign military base. "They tried to steal this moment from us," he said calmly. "They tried to turn back time." He paused. "This is not Africa of 1966. This is not Africa of 1983. We will not be toppled." The failed coup sent shockwaves far beyond Burkina Faso. In the streets of Dakar, youth rallied in solidarity. In South Africa, veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle held candlelight vigils. In the United States, black social media erupted with one phrase repeated again and again: "They tried." Africa still rises. But inside Burkina Faso, the fear lingered. Whispers spread in markets and mosques. Some wondered if the diaspora had brought danger with them. Others questioned whether unity could survive this pressure. The movement had reached its breaking point, and what came next would decide whether it collapsed or took root. The coup failed, but the damage did not disappear with it. In the days that followed, Ibrahim Traoré did not declare victory. There were no parades, no triumphant speeches. Instead, a quiet unease settled over Ouagadougou and the surrounding towns. Markets reopened, but voices were lower. Mosques filled, yet prayers lingered longer than usual. People listened not for announcements, but for signs. Fear has a way of moving silently. Some citizens began to whisper that the Diaspora project had invited danger. That foreign eyes were now fixed on Burkina Faso more intensely than ever. That welcoming people from abroad, no matter how connected by blood, had made the country a target. Others felt something different. They saw for the first time a government that did not respond to violence with mass arrests or revenge. Instead of purges, Traoré called private meetings, not with generals or foreign advisors, but with teachers, doctors, farmers, and elders. The message was consistent and deliberate. We respond with roots, not bullets. That decision shaped everything that followed. Resources were redirected not into security theatrics, but into visible civilian projects. Schools were accelerated, clinics expanded, food distribution networks were strengthened. Construction crews worked through the night repairing roads and water systems. The message to ordinary people was subtle but unmistakable. This movement is not about spectacle, it is about survival. At the same time, culture became a battleground. Music festivals appeared where rallies might have been expected. Open forums replaced press conferences. Artists, writers, and filmmakers, local and diaspora, were given space to tell stories in their own words. Not slogans, not propaganda. Stories of return, doubt, reconciliation, and shared labor. Politically, the consequences were far more complex. Within the military, fractures widened. Some officers trained under older foreign doctrines openly questioned Traoré's pace. They warned that he was moving too fast, risking isolation sanctions and internal collapse. Others, especially younger soldiers, quietly aligned themselves with the new direction drawn not by ideology, but by the visible loyalty of civilians. Internationally, pressure intensified. Sanctions tightened further. Banking access became more restricted. Aid channels slowed or froze entirely. Western diplomats spoke in careful language about stability and concerns while avoiding direct engagement with the Diaspora initiative itself. But the most significant political shift did not happen in foreign capitals. It happened among the people. In villages where skepticism had been strongest, small changes began to soften resistance. Diaspora doctors treated local patients without preference. Engineers worked alongside farmers. Elders were consulted before land was allocated. Nothing was sold outright. Everything was negotiated. Land was leased, not taken. Businesses were co-owned, not imposed. Schools taught local languages alongside diaspora history. This was not charity. It was coexistence. Still, not everyone stayed. Some diaspora families shaken by the coup attempt and media attacks chose to return abroad. Their departures were quiet, heavy with disappointment and doubt. For those who remained, the decision felt irreversible. You could hear it in how people spoke. This isn't temporary anymore. This is real. Politically, Traoré took a final controversial step during this period. He reduced his public presence. Fewer speeches, no grand appearances. Critics called it weakness. Supporters understood it differently. He was removing himself from the center. Because the truth was becoming unavoidable, the project could no longer survive as a reflection of one man. If it endured, it would be because ordinary people chose to defend it with their lives, their labor, and their patience. By the time the first anniversary of the message approached, Burkina Faso was no longer just under pressure. It was being tested. And the next phase, how the United States and the wider world would respond, would determine whether this experiment remained a local rebellion or became a global reckoning. From Washington to Brussels, the reaction followed a familiar script. At first, there was polite silence. Officials described the events in Burkina Faso as internal matters. Press briefings avoided names. Diplomatic language emphasized regional stability and ongoing assessments. But beneath the surface, concern was growing, not about violence, but about influence. Because what unsettled Western capitals was not a coup attempt. It was an idea moving faster than sanctions. In the United States, early coverage framed the movement as emotional symbolism, powerful rhetoric, but impractical. Cable panels debated whether Black Americans would ever really return to Africa. Commentators spoke about the diaspora, rarely to it. The implication was clear: this would fade. It didn't. Instead, something unexpected began to register in U.S. policy circles. Military recruitment data showed a noticeable dip in Black enlistment. Black churches redirected donations not to overseas missionary campaigns, but to WELS clinics and schools in Burkina Faso. High school classrooms in cities like Ferguson and Baltimore began screening clips of the speech during Black history discussions. This wasn't migration yet. It was alignment. Then the tone shifted. Investigative documentaries aired across major Western networks portraying Ibrahim Traoré as a dangerous populist accused of militarizing Pan-Africanism and recruiting radicals from the diaspora to destabilize West Africa. Think tanks warned of a shadow network forming outside traditional alliances. A leaked intelligence memo went further, calling the movement more dangerous than Cold War revolutionaries because it traveled through smartphones, not speeches in stadiums. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer viewed as a regional experiment. It was a global ideological threat. Across Europe, reactions mirrored Washington's unease. France avoided direct confrontation while quietly expanding surveillance. Financial institutions tightened compliance rules that disproportionately affected Burkina Faso-linked projects. Aid organizations hesitated, fearful of being accused of enabling a political agenda. Yet outside official channels, another world was responding very differently. In Brazil, Afro-descendant communities held town halls discussing return and reinvestment. In the Caribbean, cultural unions organized exchanges with Sahel artists. In London and Paris, Black students debated whether citizenship of origin mattered less than citizenship of purpose. And online, the movement refused to stay contained. A Nigerian teenager built an app archiving the speeches in multiple languages. Poets in Atlanta released spoken-word tributes that went viral overnight. Musicians from Lagos, Accra, and Johannesburg collaborated on an anthem titled "We Are Coming Home." Murals appeared in the Bronx and Compton depicting Traoré alongside Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, not as a ruler, but as a messenger. For many older Black Americans, this moment stirred something deeper. Memories of broken promises, of leaders silenced, of movements crushed before they matured. Skepticism ran high, and understandably so. Some asked hard questions. Can Africa really protect those who return? Is this unity or another dream waiting to be exploited? Can one small nation withstand the pressure of the world's most powerful systems? These doubts weren't dismissed. They were absorbed. Because what was unfolding was no longer about belief in a man. It was about confronting a reality long avoided. For the first time in generations, Africa was not asking the diaspora to pity it, fund it, or save it. Africa was asking them to stand with it. And from the perspective of the United States and the wider world, that question, quiet, persistent, and deeply unsettling, changed everything. In the end, there was no dramatic farewell, no final rally, No raised fist, frozen for the cameras. Instead, Ibrahim Traoré stepped back quietly, deliberately, allowing the movement he had ignited to stand on its own. For many observers, especially in the West, this was confusing. Leaders aren't supposed to disappear when pressure mounts. They're expected to cling tighter, speak louder, demand loyalty. But this moment was never designed to revolve around one man. In his final public address, his voice was softer than before, slower, almost tired. He did not promise victory, he did not guarantee safety. What he offered instead was something far more unsettling: choice. To my brothers and sisters in America, the Caribbean, Brazil, the UK, and beyond, he said, you were never lost. You were taken. You were never weak. You were unarmed, and you were never forgotten. Then came the warning, spoken not as a threat, but as truth. Liberation will not be handed to you. It will not come from elections alone. It will not come from slogans. It will come only when you decide where you stand, what you build, and what you refuse to accept anymore. With that, he stepped off the platform and into the crowd, dissolving into ordinary faces. No guards, no ceremony, just people. And that is where the real danger and the real power now lies. Because movements led by institutions can be sanctioned. Movements led by men can be eliminated. But movements that live inside ordinary people are far harder to silence. Years from now, children will read about what began in Burkina Faso. Some textbooks will call it reckless. Others will call it romantic. But those who lived through this moment will remember something else entirely: the feeling that for the first time, Africa was not asking for permission. For American audiences, especially those over 60 who have seen civil rights leaders rise and fall, wars sold as necessary, and promises quietly broken, this story lands differently. It doesn't ask you to pack your bags. It doesn't demand belief. It asks something simpler and far more uncomfortable. If a people who were taken by force can choose to reconnect on their own terms, what does that say about freedom today? And if Africa is no longer waiting to be saved, are we ready to stop treating it like a problem to be managed? This is why conversations around Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and Africa news are no longer distant headlines. They are mirrors reflecting questions about dignity, power, and belonging that many hoped were settled long ago. So now the story rests with you. Do you believe this movement represents real liberation or a dangerous gamble with history? Can we continue to trust leaders who awaken people, or should we trust the people once they awaken themselves? Please share your thoughts if you feel this message reached you for a reason. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. And most importantly, leave a comment. Because history doesn't move in silence.